Good morning, everyone. I'm Mthuli. I'm the Chief Economist and Vice President at the African Development Bank based in Tunis. Welcome to this session entitled Rising Expectations and the Stewardship of Natural Resources. As the African Development Bank, we are truly honored to be a part of this, to be a co-sponsor of this, focusing on an area that is very dear to us, of natural resources. Which I think particularly Africa is well known for. But of course, many more countries around the world are discovering natural resources. We're experiencing a commodity super cycle. It all looks very good. But I'm afraid the super cycle will just pass by, and a few countries will not benefit from this commodity boom. But what we've decided to do at the bank is to establish an African Natural Resource Management Center, of which the director, who was appointed officially yesterday, is sitting right here, Sheila, Khama, and welcome you to the bank. The idea is to focus on, the center will focus on a few things, sharing knowledge, capacity development, working with the African governments, negotiating better contracts, helping them to negotiate better, more transparent contracts, helping them set up sovereign wealth funds, managing sovereign wealth funds, just to make sure that these natural resources are better managed. There are rising expectations around natural resources, as you know. We had a session recently in Mozambique, and it was quite clear from the politicians, the audience, that they are expecting salaries to rise quickly. They're demanding higher wages. The same in Kenya, same in Tanzania, and here I'm just highlighting African countries. I think the same can be said across the world. How do you manage these expectations? That's what this session is about. So we'll be looking at, basically they will be sharing, I'll introduce them in a moment, panelists will be sharing their experiences. They'll be talking about global standards, transparent initiatives, reporting requirements. They'll be talking about the role of the private sector in these transparency issues, all manner of things that need to be tackled as we think about the efficient management of natural resources. We have an impressive panel, I must say. From my left, we have Professor Paul Collier, who is a professor of economics and public policy here at the Blavatnik School at Oxford. He just written yet another book. I think it's entitled The Great Exodus. But there's a more famous book, which is more linked to natural resources, entitled Plundering Planet, I think. And so he has a lot to say. He has been a big champion of the Natural Resource Charter, focusing on transparency and the better management of contracts. He's an Order of the British Empire, CBE, and that's very important. Secondly, there is Sheila, Khama. She has enormous illustrious experience in the private sector, having led Botswana, the De Beers subsidiary with the government of Botswana. That contributes, I think, 60% of the diamonds into the De Beers group, if my statistics are correct. So she knows a lot about managing diamonds and managing companies that mine, are involved in the mining sector. She's also a serious knowledge worker. She was with the African Center of Economic Transformation in Ghana before we poached her from there. So she has a lot to say about this sector generally in Africa. And then we have Richard Konteh, who is the Minister of State in Sierra Leone. He has been involved with civil society, and we know that this is a very important constituency in Africa. And he too has a lot to say about how his country is going to be implementing the Natural Resource Charter and creating greater transparency in the use of our natural resources. Last but not least, we have Simon Fraser, who is a fellow at the McKinsey Global Institute, and they've just launched a wonderful report, which I urge you all to read. I think you will talk about that, on natural resource management. And they say a few controversial things there, which I won't offload too soon. I'll leave you to do it. We're looking forward to your contribution. And of course, you've taught here before at Oxford, I think, and you're in Oxford, PhD in economics. So we have a wonderful array of panelists, and I'll each give them Davos style, 5 to 7 minutes, say your piece, and then interact, and then we go to the interactive session with the audience. Let me start with you, Paul. You've said a lot, natural resource chapter, plundering planet, migration, among other things, and people do migrate because of the conflict that natural resources cause. We have done a lot of work on conflict, post-conflict issues, and we have really linked, I think one of the few people who have linked conflict to natural resource management and natural resource care. So over to you.
Thanks, Mthuli. I mean, this session started with the notion of sort of expectations, and expectations do rise on the discovery of natural resources, and that's both a good thing and a dangerous thing. It's a good thing that people should recognize that natural resources has the potential to transform their lives. So they need to expect something. If they don't expect anything, it's unlikely that government will deliver very much. So there needs to be that pressure from expectations. But the danger is that the pressure from expectations is jammed today. We're now rich, we don't need to work anymore. Where's today's benefit? Let's put wages up now. Whereas the sad truth with natural resources is you're depleting an asset. And so if your revenues are from depleting an asset, by their nature, they're not sustainable revenues. If you deplete one asset, you better build up another asset, hopefully one that's more productive. And so that's the central task, is depleting natural resource is an opportunity to build up productive assets. And so the expectations need to be tempered by an awareness that this is going to benefit the future through prudent management. I normally at this point give the role model of Botswana and how Sir Seretse Khama initiated that good set of expectations in Botswana, but who better than Sheila Khama to tell that story? So I won't preempt that, I think, but I would encourage her to tell it. So if that's the core task, partly people have got to learn patience, and then partly the government has got to conceptualize that things are not just about the natural resource itself. And there's a sort of easy fixation on if it's gas, it's something to do with adding value to gas. If it's oil, we better refine it. If it's iron ore, we better refine it. Whereas the big opportunity is to turn that natural asset into productive assets that might be completely unrelated. My image of the really useful transformation is to turn natural resources into well-functioning cities. You take the resources from under the ground and you build effective cities on top of the ground. Because effective cities, we know, will be the platforms for whatever you diversify into once the resources have run out. And yet it's hard for government to think beyond the natural resource that's sort of under your nose and think, well, actually, a lot of the opportunities may be completely unrelated. A good role model here is Malaysia, which 45 years ago looked very, very like one of the less well-functioning African societies. Very poor, ethnically fractured, natural resources, not much else. The last 40 years, I think the Malaysian economy has grown something like 40 times. And now we don't think of it as a natural resource economy. We still get some natural resource revenues, but basically it's a global electronics player. Now, the original finance to get the electronics centers going, Penang and so on, that came from wisely used revenues from natural resources, but it wasn't a natural resource bet. It wasn't saying, let's refine the tin. It's saying, let's break into this upcoming market light electronics. And let's turn this impoverished fishing village of Penang into the future. So that's the conceptual leap. On that note, let me pass on.
Pass on to Sheila. Paul, the Alaska model, and maybe I should pose the question to Sheila as well, where the idea is that you need the citizens to feel that they have a new discovery, natural resources. So why not give them direct cash transfers from some oil fund or something directly to the citizens, not through either efficient taxation or building infrastructure, which they can't really link directly to natural resources. What have you got to say about it?
Well, I am pretty skeptical of that approach. And my skepticism is because it's so easily just seen by ordinary people as a sort of welfare payment. I mean, in a way, this is what the Middle East does.
That's right.
But it kind of just ends up paying people not to work. And paying people not to work doesn't necessarily lead them to invest in the future. It just they invest in leisure. And, poor societies are going to have to work hard. Africa is desperately short of infrastructure. Giving money to ordinary people and they then use it to have a higher level of consumption, that's not building a sustainable future. Now, the fancy model that is recommended by a think tank in Washington is you give it to people, but then you tax it back. And my answer to that is get real. Give it to people. They're going to spend it. They're going to build in an assumption that is a welfare payment for life.
Thank you. Sheila, Paul says that we should use the natural resource process to build cities that work, to build infrastructure, and so forth. And in Botswana, you have gone the beneficiation route, in the sense of, cutting dams in Botswana. You've gone down further down the value chain, so to speak. I mean, tell us about that. What motivated that? Do you really feel it's a value? But also anything you may wish to say.
Yes, thank you, Professor Ncube. I mean, I want to talk about the handing out of checks to citizens. I mean, in my mind, it's a fundamental abdication of the state's responsibility. The state is there to regulate, to provide social services, and you can't abdicate that to the very citizens that are reliant on you for their welfare. But more importantly, in the context of Africa, first of all, you need to be able to find the people, which is to say you have to have a database of who your citizens are, reach them, and have a network to facilitate that distribution. As it happens, that database, that network is not available. And that if you were to introduce a system like that, chances are that it would be ineffective at best and at worst abused. So in my mind, it's a non-starter. It might work in Alaska, but certainly I don't see it working on the African continent. But to your question of Botswana, I mean, let me say that I work for the private sector, so I don't at all take any credit for Botswana's policies, but I am a beneficiary of those policies. My education, as many of my generation, was only possible because of those policies. And so what are these policies? Let's start first with the high-level stewardship. And I think when we speak of expectations, it's important to express expectation at its most profound, which is if a country is well endowed with natural resources, what realistically, first of all, should be the vision of those policymakers in terms of how do you turn what is really a natural windfall, a geological windfall, into something that economically can then be used to better the lot of your people. In my mind, as a citizen of the world, this is my first expectation, that governments need to step back and ask themselves that question. And it is not as easy as it appears, because there are, of course, options, and with options, there are trade-offs. My first expectation is that there has to be clarity of, one, what are we going to use fundamentally these resources for? Are they going to be a source of revenue? Are they going to be a vehicle for infrastructure? Are they in fact going to be the basis for planning and financing economic plans? Now, these things, the questions seem simple, but actually the answers themselves are very complex and they require thinking. Here is why they are complex. In order to achieve this, first of all, it assumes you know your natural endowment, the extent of it. It also assumes you know the economic value of it. It also knows that you have the ability and capacity to sequence the exploitation, but also to time the extraction and therefore to manage the marketing. These are not small issues. And in my mind, part of what Paul and you learned people describe as, I think you call it the resource chaos, stems from this failure to be able to disaggregate what are apparently simplistic questions, but really very complex. And any country that does not interrogate as many of those questions as possible and as successfully as possible really sets itself a failure. And coming then to Botswana did ask herself that question. Botswana said, first of all, we have been blessed with the largest deposits of gem diamonds by value in the world today. What does this mean for us? And Botswana determined that it meant three things. One, that as a country, they would never spend mining revenue on recurrent expenditure. This is built into Botswana's fiscal policy. The second was that between the development expenditure and savings in the sovereign fund, that in development expenditure, they would only focus on three areas. One, education, infrastructure, and health. I think the split is infrastructure 42%, education 39%, and the balance is on education. And so there is a country that said, for us, this is what it means. Now, history might come to prove that they were flawed in their judgment, but certainly there is no flaw in instituting a well thought out plan, and then having the discipline, which is another answer to your question, how and why is Botswana perceived to have got some of these issues correct? Actually, they stick to it. For 42 years, they have done it that way. And continuously, we as citizens of Botswana have come to then expect, which comes again to now citizen expectations. Why do citizen expectations elsewhere rise but seem not to have been met? There are several reasons. Government play politics with natural resources. This is God's truth. Every government of the day perceives themselves to be de facto the political beneficiary of this resource. So what do? The first thing they do is if they say discovery, they throw a headline, we have discovered oil. And then, of course, to us, the villagers, we think, oh, oil. That means that now I'll have a school, now I'll have a hospital, now I'll be better off. Actually, they fail to translate this headliner into a practical experience at citizens level, which is to say, actually, if you see the dollar, you will be damn lucky. But if you do see it, actually, it'll be 15 years down the road. And when you do see it, actually, it won't be on a personal level. And the failure of governments to communicate this, what it means in terms of discovery, but also the time lag between discovery and actual pumping and then the distribution of revenue, actually, in many cases, it's a generational gap. And unless we are able to translate this reality, there's always going to be a distortion between that which we say and that which the citizens experience. The result is a fallout. Shall I leave it at that for now?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Citizens have a long time to wait before they really see the benefits. It takes time. Timing is complex. And then we have to unpack this resource case. That's what they said. But Botswana is very clear on what it will invest in: infrastructure, education, health. That's very useful indeed. Let me attend to you, Thompson. Tell us a bit about the McKinsey report. Okay. Thank you. Closer to the mic. You have produced this wonderful report, which we're all dying to hear what the central key messages are and the findings are. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much. So over the past 12 months, we've been working on a report called Reverse the Curse. And thanks very much for the congratulations. It really is thanks that's due to many people in this room. Paul was a key advisor. Sheila gave us some very good input about 6 and 7 months ago. And overall, we spoke to roughly 100 academics, over 50 policymakers, and over 40 extractive companies. So it really was trying to get the sum of the wisdom in these different areas. And the question we were trying to ask was really twofold. From a government perspective, how do we think about the question of translating subsoil wealth into long-term prosperity? And many have looked at it before, but when we talk to policymakers, the question that they kept asking us was, how do we get away from this kind of cookie-cutter approach of saying, here's what worked in Norway, how do we adapt that to work in our local context? And then the second question we asked was, how do you think about this as an extractive company, either an oil and gas company or mining company? They're moving increasingly into these jurisdictions where their role is going beyond just being an efficient extractor to doing more in terms of local development. And how do they think about marrying that obligation with shareholder value? And it's a tough one. Many CEOs recently have lost their jobs on failures to get some of these projects off the ground. So that was the context. And some of the interesting things we found was, first of all, when you look at the resourcing landscape, we're in an era of fundamental change. When you look at the number of countries that are resource driven, and that is countries where resources represent a large share of exports, fiscal revenues, or GDP, it used to be there was 58 countries that were resource driven in 1995. Now, if we look today, that's gone to 81. So a 40% increase in a fairly short period of time. And you've got a number of governments that are dealing with these issues for the first time, keen not to repeat the mistakes and the resource curse that has befallen other resource-rich countries. Now, look, going forward, the prospects in some hands are pretty good. We obviously can't forecast resource prices, but when we look at investment, we can see in some cases a doubling of the historical investment rate in oil and gas and minerals. And that's not just because of this consuming demand in China and India, but it's also because a lot of the existing sources of supply are coming to the end of their natural life. Peter Voser, the CEO of Shell, probably put it best when he said, just to keep oil supply constant, the world has to find the equivalent of 4 Saudi Arabias and 10 North Seas. And where are we going to find these new sources of supply? Increasingly, they're in less developed, low-income countries. So there's a huge potential opportunity here. And we size what some of that potential could be. And in the high case, we see the potential to, these flows could be triple the aid flows to these countries. It could also be the greatest poverty alleviation story we've seen since China over the last 2 decades. If you look at the fact that 70% of the world's remaining poor live in resource-driven countries, it is a huge opportunity not only for economic development, but to fight the world's fight on poverty levels. So that's the upside. The historical track record when we looked at these resource-driven countries wasn't great. And many of them have actually underperformed in economic growth versus non-resource-driven countries. But more broadly than that, there's been a failure to translate wealth into long-term prosperity. We developed a new index to try to get at this, and it really shows the underperformance. To give you a couple of examples, in Zambia and Nigeria, we saw actually quite robust growth over the last decade, but poverty levels were actually increasing. So there's a real disconnect between growth and prosperity. So the question is, well, where do we go from here? And what we argue in our report is that the 20th century model of resource development is not going to work. What also is not going to work is an Asian tiger model of growth. It's a question we get asked by a lot of policymakers, and it's a fair question. This has been the most successful economic transformation model of the last 20 to 30 years, based on export-driven, manufacturing-focused growth. Unfortunately, that model is not fit for purpose for most resource-driven countries. So what we call for is a new model, and we've dubbed it the resource tiger model. And what it has is basically 3 quite simple objectives.
Did you say resource tiger model?
The resource tiger model, okay. Exactly. And the first aspect is you have to produce the resources efficiently. Makes sense? Secondly, you have to capture value from that resources. And third, you have to transform that value into long-term development. Now, I won't go into all the different aspects we look into it, but I'll just give you a couple of examples of where we think this can lead to new insights. Infrastructure is a big issue, and we heard from Sheila and Paul that the infrastructure challenges in many of these countries. There's a lot of focus on shared infrastructure. So how do we think about sharing railways? How do we think about sharing roads, power, water that's used by the resource sector and could be either used by the operators or by community members? And it's a fair objective, and we find that roughly 10% of the infrastructure needs could be met through this sharing model. The problem is when we look at the sharing today, it tends to be happening in the wrong places. In many cases, the sharing railways can lead to benefits, but it has a huge amount of costs of efficiency losses and coordination costs. Whereas things like power and water often have a much more greater upside compared to the costs. The other area is around local content. And it's an area where a lot of policymakers are very interested in, and 90% of the countries we looked at had local content legislation. The problem was that a lot of it was poorly designed. It was either focused on the wrong value pools, so very small value pools, or on value pools that were disconnected from local capabilities. It was also, in terms of the actual contract terms, there was no phase-in agreements, there was no sunset clauses that would lead to efficiency opportunities for companies to meet international standards over time. And finally, there was not enough support on actually helping the private sector capture some of the upside opportunities. And then the final thing is around economic diversification, which we looked at. And there, as Paul said, there's a lot of focus on beneficiation and downstream. What we saw in the report is that there's very few successful examples of this. In many cases, this led to a large opportunity cost and a large waste of taxpayer funds. One of the other areas that we think doesn't get enough focus today is what we call local services. These are things like retail trade, retail banking. They're not the most exciting sectors in some cases, but they're large employers of people. There's significant productivity barriers across different areas of these economies. And there's also, they tend to grow quite significantly after a resources boom. So we look at some of the opportunities that countries have done in local services. So to sum up, we think there's a huge opportunity over this next 20 years, but we don't think the current model is going to be fit for purpose. The good news is that there's a lot of best practice out there from various resource-driven countries. The key is how to adapt it to local circumstances. So that's the country side. And just to finish up on the private sector side, we also have been looking at how companies perform on these issues. And we found three key gaps. We found that companies tend to have misaligned priorities with the local communities in which they operate. To give you one example, a company we worked with, they were focusing a lot on the environment, which is fine, but they were going far and beyond sort of the mandatory requirements. But at the same time, they were doing very little on job creation and local supply chain development. And those were the key issues of the local stakeholders. So they're spending a lot of money, but not feeling like they're actually getting any return for that. The second gap is we often see a failure of these companies to communicate effectively of what they're doing to governments and other key stakeholders. So you see across the board when we surveyed local stakeholders, a much poorer perception of what the companies were doing vis-a-vis their own perception and where we would assess them. And finally, there's a lack of really building the business case that we see in companies. That they'll do, they'll build a school here, they'll do a hospital here, but they don't really link that to, well, what's the potential benefit to shareholders from that? How will it improve license to operate? How will it improve supply chain management, input costs, etc.? And obviously it's not going to be a clear-cut answer, but what we find is that those companies that can start to think in business case terms better link it to shareholder value, and that leads to longevity of what they're doing. And actually,
Fraser, I have to stop you there.
Thank you, sir.
That's right. I think Minister Konteh has been waiting to jump in. He's been listening attentively to all of this. What do you make of it, sir?
Thank you very much. I must start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to come and share my own perspectives about the issue of natural resources, rights, expectations, and stewardship. Because my country, Sierra Leone, happens to be a natural resource-rich country. However, the benefits of this are not exactly so well translated into the lives of our people. And in my present role as the Chief of Staff in the Office of the President, I also have the unfortunate responsibility of being involved in many of these ongoing negotiations about contracts. Because the fact is, and what Sheila said was true, a few weeks back we announced that we found oil. What that means therefore for our people is that money in the pocket. We also, when we came back for our second term, said it's now agenda for prosperity. And everybody said, wow, that means the government should not give us money so that we all become rich. And when we again tell them that, oh, now we have X number of mining companies exporting iron ore, and they say our GDP is projected to grow at over 35% initially, and they said, wow, it's all money. And gradually they started revising the figure, and now we are in the 20s. But that again is very, very high compared to other countries, and they say going forward it will continue to grow consistently over 10% for the foreseeable future because of the projection of this sector. These are all issues that tend to swell up people's expectations. But as a country, we are conscious that we have to be weary of the Dutch disease. We have to make sure the natural resources we have don't become a curse for us. But critical to us as a country to be able to derive much from this has to do with the type of contracts we enter into. And the major constraint our governments face and my government faces has to do with the fact that we don't even have the information. It is the very mining company that comes and says they've done the study, and they tell you, we found that you have this quantity of minerals. Usually they'll just tell you a report on one. The others that they find they will never tell you. And then based upon those figures, they say, let's negotiate a contract. And in the process of negotiating the contract, they keep shifting the table. Oh, we've revised our figures. The moment they see that, oh, you want to increase this corporation tax, you want to increase the royalty, they start adjusting their figures to suit them. So what is therefore critical for us as a government is for us to be able to do a study, an aeromagnetic study, to be able to determine exactly what we have. And that, I think, is critical going forward. We also have to realize that these resources will not be there forever. Therefore, as we plan, as we manage, as we demonstrate our stewardship, we have to ensure that we also reserve some for the future. That is why we have launched what we call the Transformational Development Fund, which is a fund...
Transformation Development Fund.
Yes. Which is there to ensure that the resources from our natural resources, the proceeds, are not exhausted, but stored for the future. But the way we put this reserve for the future is in two phases. The first phase is you invest now for the future, which means building the infrastructure needed to stimulate economic growth, and then having some reserves for the rainy day when these things would run out. We also have a responsibility to ensure that the legal regimes, the policy environment is also sound. And in doing all of these, we have to ensure that we take our people along. Oftentimes, the reason why we have these high expectations is because there's an information gap. You just tell them, we have these minerals, full stop. You come back, you say, we have oil, full stop. Oh, that will lead to an exponential growth in our GDP, full stop. You don't go into details of doing what Sheila just said. How do you then go down to let people understand that this does not necessarily mean money shared, dished out to people, but rather, even when the resources come, they'll come over time, and oftentimes they will come for overall national development. So people, therefore, cannot even understand why they remain unemployed. The youths believe that this should immediately be translated into jobs. And jobs is not only for them to work very hard. Maybe it is the Middle East model in some countries where there are very few, they have so much, and then there's enough to go around. We, however, as a country, look at these things going forward. We remain committed to the EITI process to bring a bit more transparency into this whole mining. We are committed to the Natural Resource Charter, which I coordinate at the moment on behalf of government, working with Paul Collier and others, and the Africa Mining Vision. We have thought that the natural resources of any country would only make sense if they impact positively on the people and their economies. Therefore, we have indeed passed the local content policy. And as Minister of Trade and Industry before, I actually championed it. And what we are saying in that policy is four things. We are saying, let's add value to our natural resources. Let's stop exporting things raw. That would help us generate more, create jobs, and grow the economy. We are saying, in the award of contracts, give some preference to local content, where the technical provisions have been met. So if you are going to award a contract, usually there are two processes. There's a technical evaluation and there's a financial evaluation. If you have gone through the technical evaluation and there's a company with a high local content, even if their own financial bid is not necessarily the most responsive, for a gap of up to 15%, we can still give it. We are saying give it to the local company because we believe that Sierra Leoneans have to benefit. We're also saying employ Sierra Leoneans. It makes no sense to say we have all of these resources, all of these investments in the country, and no Sierra Leoneans are employed. You just see a lot of expatriate labor. It's even not good for the companies themselves, economically going forward. I think it's cheaper for them to employ. So I was saying 20% senior management employ Sierra Leoneans, 50% middle-level management employ Sierra Leoneans, and then the rank and file employ Sierra Leoneans. But we are saying we do acknowledge that the capacity might not be immediately available. So we are saying over a 5-year period, where the expertise does not exist locally, have a training plan to build the capacity of Sierra Leoneans to be able to take over eventually. And we think that would be a win-win for everyone. And lastly, we are saying allow Sierra Leoneans to participate in the ownership of these companies so that it's not all foreign-owned. And before you realize it, the entire country is in the hands of non-Sierra Leoneans. So that is a...
Is that through community trust, or what mechanism are you using for that?
No, it's part of our local content policy, which we are now going to make it a law that 20% of the ownership of all of these companies have to be Sierra Leonean. The argument often given is that Sierra Leoneans don't have the money. And I always counter by saying, do you have the money? The money you are using to say you are coming to invest, it's not your money. You come, you get the concession, and then you go to the bank and raise a loan. And then you come and invest it. So the Sierra Leoneans can do the same. Just give them the contracts, and they will also go and take the same loans and also share in the process of paying back those loans over a period. So these are some of the issues. I think I want to stop here at the time to say we as a country do observe this as an issue, and we are committed to addressing it over time.
Yeah, I'll allow you to come back, but Sheila, in Botswana, it is the government that owns. Is it what percent? 50%?
50%.
But anyway, that's another, you can answer it. But I'm sure you wanted to say something about value addition as well. Do you want to chip in there?
I am giggling because the minister has just put the spanner in the works of what I define as an inherently counterintuitive policy position when placed in front of investors who by nature are multinationals. And they are multinationals because that gives them scale and that affords them a competitive advantage. And interestingly, Minister, the very nature of every country in the Mano River region saying you will localize your procurement in Liberia, and then in Sierra Leone, and then in Guinea, and then in Botswana, and then in the DRC, distort the very concept of a multinational corporation. And yet, they are able to source finance. They are able to undertake R&D and be able to mine or pump oil in very difficult circumstances because they have scale. Now, it's not an argument against local content per se. It says that as we contemplate these policies, it's important to understand that inherently there are certain trade-offs, and that when we ask investors to make those trade-offs, and an intended consequence means there might be that the project economic performance of the oil field in Sierra Leone is economically not as good as it could be from a fiscal perspective. And so the issue is not whether or not you have local content. The issue is in saying we have enacted a law that demands that citizens will have a share, that we have enacted a law that requires that you will procure within the frontiers of Sierra Leone. How does that impact project economics? And how does that impact the return on yourself? And are you comfortable that that trade-off is the best you can make in the interest of the people of Sierra Leone, speaking of expectations. And when I say, Paul, that it is important for governments to interrogate, that's exactly what I mean. But clearly there is no answer. Every country must determine what is relevant. But the science of how you get there is very important. So now let me come to the question you asked of Botswana. Botswana has determined, and they're very straightforward. In Botswana, the leadership says that we will extract these resources on behalf of the people of Botswana, and as luck would have it, the world feels they do a relatively good job, so we are lucky. But of course, what we are seeing in Sierra Leone is that you could very well have a government that either doesn't have the capacity nor the appetite to adopt a paternalistic view. And as the Sierra Leone government has taken, they would rather they empower citizens and say, you take shares and you be shareholders, and hopefully the citizens are responsible, they pay tax, and in the end, the state coffers are still better off. On the issue of value addition, I mean, I think principally you can't but accept that to the extent that countries in Africa and Latin America have natural resources, the longer the value chain in the source country, the greater the economic spin-offs. But as with everything, this is much, much more simpler than it really appears. And here are a couple of reasons from a policy perspective why it's important to interrogate that on a case-by-case basis. It isn't always true that the countries that produce raw materials are also, in terms of efficiency and return on investment, the best to sweat the asset. My argument is that it is important to balance domestic linkages with efficiency in exploitation, marketing, processing, and everything. Because after all, we call it a value chain because every pocket of it has an inherent value that you must extract. And every time, at any stage, that extraction is inefficient, you distort the economics of the whole chain. In other words, the chain of the diamond industry is only as strong as Botswana's own management of its resources as the lead producer is efficient. When Botswana's extraction becomes efficient, guess what? The entire industry becomes inefficient. The result is that ultimately Botswana's command of the price of rough will drop, and it is Botswana that will pay the price. And so I don't want to belay the point. It is exactly understanding these dynamics and how they relate that is so vital. And I'm asking you, young people in this room, with your brains, to help us think through these policies, to say, how can we rationalize these policy debates for governments so that their point of departure is correct, and that it is not only their moral willingness that is sound, but that is backed by sound policy and economic rationale, so that we end up in this new tiger model that Fraser has advocated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Thank you. It's over to you now. We need your input, your questions right over. I'll take 3 at a time, right here, straight ahead. Oh, there's a microphone, okay.
Hi, Cornelia Mayo, and I come originally from the oil side of the equation, private sector oil side. I have sort of 2 questions, and they both go to Ms. Shanna and Dr. Thompson. First of all, one of the things that is in that debate that you're talking, there's also a need for capacity building, institution building, and I would wonder, how can IFIs help, and what have you found in your report in terms of the institutions that have to deal with the natural resources exploitation? If you, for instance, have customs officials and you can't get your equipment in, as we see in Iraq these days, or things like that, that's not good. So what can one do, and what have you seen? And the second one, thank you for so aptly pointing out the localization of the supply chain. It is still one of the ways in which you can get employment, especially the oil side, upstream and downstream. There's not many jobs in it. the job is in the oil field services, and some organizations have been quite good at dealing with localization of supply chain. For instance, Schlumberger, who now does most of its pumps somewhere in Siberia because that's how they had to localize. So it can be a very good model if well applied to actually help build an industry that can then be a global exporter and produce at international standards. So have you thought of how one could help governments get the right policies in there to enable them to do that?
Thank you. There's a question over there. Then I'll come back over across.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed, and I'm an MPP student at the Blavatnik School of Government. My question is directed to Sheila and Richard, and in a way it contemplates what Sheila has asked us to do in terms of thinking about the rationale that governments could adopt in terms of thinking about these deep questions. My question is from the politics side of things. Now, you talk about, adopting a narrative when countries come to discover natural resources in which citizens will be informed properly about the stages in which the natural resource cycle will go through to they show up on the ground to the benefit of the citizens. And that's fine when you talk about something that everybody will take for granted. But what happens in real politics? What you leave behind is basically what other people will pick up and use against you. Now, arguing for something that is quite rational in using the resources from underground to the time that it actually shows to the benefit of the citizens, there's a time span to be considered. Now, your political oppositions will simply play the opposite game, which is basically, we're actually willing to do the right thing for you, which is, give you the benefit now. How could you make governments listen to the rationale voice in that case?
Very good question. There's someone right here, straight ahead. I'll take one more and then we go to the panel.
My name is Maria Masila. I'm an MPP student at the Blavatnik School of Government. My question concerned another side of the puzzle concerning corruption and transparency in resource management, especially in Africa. And my question is concerning the need of having an integrated model or framework which integrate the whole process, meaning the value chain from negotiation of contracts to extraction, and as well spending of revenue on development in the countries. Right now we have the EITI framework, which helps a little bit have countries comply in publishing the reports on the revenue they collect. However, that does not include in most countries the upstream activities of negotiation contracts, and also doesn't tell how those collected money are distributed among national agencies and regions across. Don't you think that there is a present need, or is there models right now working on how to integrate all those activities, and also even promote a stronger focus on collaboration among regional countries, continental collaboration and regional collaboration of African countries on improving the management of those resources, and a stronger push even on political will by maybe integrating those imperatives with other interests that leaders value in countries, such as loans by international financial organizations, but having a more integrated model which take all this into account.
Okay, thank you. I'll give that question to Paul. One more, then I go to the panel, to my left. Yes, please. Yes, directly behind you.
Who wants to steal your thunder?
Not easy.
Thank you. My name's Iona. I'm an MPP student here at the Blavatnik School. So it seems, from what you're saying, there seems to have emerged or been put forward this model of how best to use natural resource revenues for development. But then at the same time, we're seeing on the government side some very real constraints in terms of asymmetries of information and power between governments and extractive companies and governments and their citizens, which are meaning they're finding it really hard to be able to do these sort of best practice models. I wonder to what extent it's realistic to go for these models, and to what extent that maybe second or third best option models might be able to still realise some of these benefits rather than this sort of all or nothing approach. So I wonder if you could say something about that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Abusing my position.
Yes.
So mine is a really simple one. So countries have natural resources, they want jobs. What's the one first thing each panelist would say to that government to do?
Love it. Jobs and resources. So I'll start with you, Paul. Have a go.
Yeah, let me start with kind of sort of linking three questions about loans, future politicians, and institutions. And here's the danger that natural resources enable countries to borrow. You discover natural resources, you've got some sort of collateral that investment banks will happily float you a sovereign bond, and you can get a tidal wave of money coming in. And this has already started in Africa. It's going to be a really big deal. Effectively what politicians are doing there is mortgaging future natural resources by borrowing, because the implicit collateral is the future natural resource. What's to constrain that process? You need rules and institutions that are basically trying to lock politicians, both now and the next generation, into commitments about how the money should be used. And that's partly just sheer honesty, but it's also, beyond honesty, it's spending it on productive assets. And one of the things that Botswana did was build institutions to ensure that money spent domestically on infrastructure, such like, actually met proper criteria of cost-benefit analysis and decent return. So you didn't get a lot of money wasted on, sort of foolish things that claimed to be investment but were actually sort of luxury government consumption. So building those specialist institutions is really important. You need rules which define the institution, competent mandated teams which are the institution. As it were, so you've got the rules, the mandated teams with the skills to implement the rules, but then you've got to build a critical mass of citizens who understand what they're for. Otherwise, the rules and the institutions are just, words on paper in a way. Finally, a word about Naira's question about jobs. Well, the first thing is to recognize that broadly, natural resource extraction itself doesn't create many jobs. So that's not where the jobs are going to come. In the short term, if you build a lot of infrastructure, the building of the infrastructure does generate a lot of jobs. Construction is the sector which can really employ a lot of people. Now, it's then important to run the construction sector in such a way that locals acquire the skills so that they actually are the workforce in the construction sector. I mean, the downside with the Chinese model, it'll build you infrastructure fast, but it'll be the Chinese labor force that does it. So that's a perfect bypass onto your main engine for jobs, I think. Now, Africa is so short, not just of infrastructure, but of structures more generally. Decent housing, one of the big things that you can invest for decades in Africa is decent housing. Get rid of the slums and put people in decent housing in cities. And building that decent housing could generate millions of jobs. So I would look to that connection: natural resources, revenue spent on infrastructure and structures, that's the sector which generates the jobs in the short run. Eventually, you get effective cities, and they then become platforms for a whole lot of employment. But start with the construction sector.
Sheila.
Just a couple of questions. The first one, which was on capacity building, and in many ways yours was the same. It seems to me that the most important thing is to be clear what the role of government is and not burden government with doing things that are essential private sector or better private sector led. I think this is important because when governments try then to be all things to everyone, then the risk is failure and really misuse of public resource. So when governments contemplate capacity, the fundamental question is capacity to do what? What is it that if you did efficiently as a government, the outcome would be that the exploitation of your resources would be optimal? And that to me is where we should limit the issue of capacity. And so I think in terms of how then do you help them, I think then you start, as you would do with everything, you would say, you know, what is the bare essentials? Now, interestingly, Paul is, as you no doubt have realized, is a big fan of Botswana, and sometimes tout Botswana unfairly so. But in one respect, Paul is correct. When Botswana discovered diamonds, there were only 25 graduates in that country. Now I can tell you, in many African countries to this day, they have 200,000 graduates, and they can't pull it off. Now, I'll tell you about capacity. The greatest capacity you can give any government is the capacity to want to do the right thing. Because when they don't have the skill in Botswana, because they do want to get things right, guess what? They will go and source it. They will go and seek it. So I do have to say capacity is important. But the most important question is what kind of capacity and whose capacity anyway? As a citizen of Botswana paying tax, I have no appetite for the government of Botswana to try and breed a lawyer in the public service to represent me. I'd rather they go to the City of London, which they do, pay Nigel Boardman from Slaughter and Maize. You can Google Nigel Boardman. He has been Botswana's lawyer for 30 years, and pay him the same rate he commands in the city, because guess what? I know I'm going to be very well represented. So I think there is internal and then external capacity, and it's key to know what you outsource and what as a government you have from inside. I'll just speak to your question of what about jobs. Paul is right. En masse, the oil, gas, and mineral sector doesn't deliver a lot of jobs. Having said that, in many countries, given the level of employment, even the few jobs that can be got, we must do everything in our power to secure them. And the starting point is training, but particularly training in vocational skills, and not so much your geologists or engineers, because the soggy middle of employment in the industry is in this middle sector, the operators and so forth. But there's another economic reason why you should invest in that area. It is because actually your electrician on an oil grid, on a mine pit, on a construction site, in a manufacturing site requires the same skill. So these skills are transferable. Guess what too? These are the same young people who are restless now and are really a time bomb waiting to explode. But more to the point, these skills lend themselves to self-employment. And so it is an investment in a skill set that is replicable and transferable across many sectors. I'll give my other colleagues a chance.
Absolutely. Fraser, over to you. I think there's a question on building local supply chains and all that.
Yeah, so on the local supply chains, we saw that there was a number of successful cases, both across companies and governments. And they always varied in context, but they had four things in common. The first was that they actually started with really understanding where the value is. And so one example in Morocco, the OCP, before they even started production, they spent quite a lot of time on just mapping, understanding the whole supply chain that they needed, what was immediately localizable, and what had the potential to be localizable in a sort of a 3 to 5 year time frame, and then went to the government with that plan. The second thing is that there's an array of market failures that need to be addressed. And these are anything from the contract size to the lack of information on exactly the services and goods needed. And many governments and many companies have addressed that through unbundling contracts, through creating central portals so people can see all the contracts easily. The third area was around the capabilities. And here, beyond the usual things, I think there's some interesting models of how do you upskill quickly. The example I like is there's lots of these, but BHP Billiton in Chile with Codelco. And when they were trying to get a local supply chain kick-started in a short period of time, they actually did exchange of employees. And so put some of their best operators in these different companies and got them very quickly up to the kind of standard that they needed, much faster than would have otherwise happened. And then finally, the last bit, I think this gets to Sheila's point, that the regulation and monitoring, because these sometimes can go awry. And you need to make sure that if the opportunity cost starts to add up and you're getting huge delays, that you can steer course again. And I think Kazakhstan actually did this well. The original version of the local content policy was not actually particularly good in some aspects, but they changed course, and I think where they've got to now is a lot stronger.
Thank you very much. Minister Konteh.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me start by commenting on this whole issue. Maybe it's a misunderstanding of what I said about local content. Let me comment on the issue of localizing procurement. It should be looked at from 2 points of view. It's one thing to say that in the procurement process, there are certain services that can be provided by locals. For example, haulage. You don't need to go and, it's not rocket science to do haulage. And we've seen a case in Seattle recently where haulage contracts were awarded by a mining company to a foreign company, and then they didn't have the capacity. They ended up using locals that had the capacity to do the haulage. But what we are saying here is that rather this is the simplest part of it. The more critical part of it is how do you ensure that in the process of procurement, the local economy also benefits. If all the mining companies generate all of their procurement externally, then the value of all the exports will never be realized locally. But if they use the local banks to generate the procurement, then at least the banks will also have the economic benefits of those transactions. So that is what we are talking about here when we talk about how do you ensure that procurement is localized. And on the issue about capacity, of course, we all share the view, and even in the local content policy, it's acknowledged that we don't have the capacity now. Paul will tell you that as a country, we've relied on his advice a few times. We have Herbert Smith who provide pro bono services. We are always bringing in experts. You have come to Sierra Leone a few times to work with us in terms of restructuring my office. You advised for the setting up of my office in Sierra Leone. So the government does do that. However, we are seeing that in the process of doing that, you have to build local capacity because we cannot rely on foreign expert capacity forever. So that's why even in the policy, we are saying over a 5 years period, build that capacity. And you should also, as part of your corporate social responsibility, make it part of your obligation to build that local capacity so it is not indefinite. The issue about how to make people listen to national voices is really what we are talking about when we said, take the people along. When you give the people half-truths, inadequate information, they will fill in the blanks for you. But if you really take your time to educate the people fully about all of the issues, and like you said, about the fact that just because we have diamonds does not mean that it is money in everybody's pocket tomorrow. But then you send a clear message, it will take time, and even when the resources come, it is meant for the overall good and not to be shared around. It's helpful. That is critical. On the issue of corruption, you asked for an integrated approach. That is why, for example, for us, we did not stop at the AITI. But let me hasten to state at this point that for us, this issue about all of these indicators, AITI compliance, NRC charter, MCC requirements, etc., it's almost becoming like a new, like the Vogue. Oh, you have to comply, you have not complied, we are delisting you, we are this. And before you realize it, it becomes now an issue of checklist. Oh, have I met this? That is not the point. As a country, we have to initially be convinced that there are benefits in sound natural resource governance, full stop. If that process of complying with EITI, NRC, Africa Mining Vision would help us to achieve that, hallelujah. But let us not be doing this just because we want EITI to say we have passed. We want MCC to say we have passed. No. But let us do it because we believe as a government that this can mean well for us. That is why, for example, when we realized that there are limitations with the EITI, we went for the NRC. And now in Sierra Leone, we're not taking the NRC in isolation of the Africa Mining Vision because they are complementary and we believe it can go forward. And how, on the issue of jobs, well, contrary to what Paul said, I think the raw mining itself can create jobs. African Minerals creates in excess of 2,000-3,000 jobs. London Mining creates a few hundred jobs. That helps. It does not reduce. It helps the job. But it's true that going forward, the way you add the beneficiation process can create jobs. The services that come to support this booming industry can create jobs. That is where the actual money lies. That is really where we need to go if we want to ensure that our countries have the full benefits from this.
Thank you. Thank you. You have a question? I'll take one and then two, maybe three, but you start.
Paul, I wanted to come back to your point earlier about building cities as opposed to conditional cash transfers, and I wonder if this should be considered appropriate to each context. I spent most of my life in Mozambique, and what you've seen is that cities have supported the idea of elite capture, even in natural resources, as well as only supporting foreigners and really not integrating the needs of local communities. And so my question is, the government has just introduced a policy next year to give parts of tax revenues to those communities for development programs. Is this a weakness in the government's part, or is it realizing the realities of pre-existing inequalities? And I would argue that that's a government's responsibility.
Thank you. And they're about to take up arms, I thought. In parts of some communities are about to take up arms or are taking up arms in Mozambique. Absolutely. Thank you. In the back, yes, please go ahead. Yeah. Now I have to do a lottery for the last one, so I don't know how I'm going to do this.
We don't know who it is. We'll both take a question. Mine is quite short. I'd like to ask the panel whether you think there are any countries in which the prospects of successfully transforming resource wealth into development are so poor that it would be preferable to leave the resources under the ground. And I'm thinking of, mining Central African Republic, reports of drilling for oil offshore Somalia, offshore Western Sahara. And if that is the case, is there any way of actually achieving that? Or should we all continue to try to do what we can to contribute to making things less bad?
Thank you. Now, last question. Now I'm going to do a lottery. Wow. Who's going to pay me the most? Okay, right here. Straight ahead.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm a master's candidate at the University Center for the Environment. And I noticed that environment was mentioned twice. And one of the instances was when you, Mr. Thompson, was saying that a certain company should perhaps focus less on environmental efforts because the community valued jobs more. So I was wondering what the feeling on the ground in countries that are focusing on resource development was for kind of investing oil and gas revenues into lower carbon energy futures.
Okay. Who are you directing that question to? Just curious. Anyone? So any of them can answer. Oh, okay. So short answers to the panel. The panel is Paul.
The Mozambique question is a tough one, isn't it? That you suppose you've got a trade-off between investing in cities and investing in rural communities. Mozambique is a really good coastal position, so if you can envisage Mozambique in 50 years' time, You know, a lot of the population is going to shift to the coast, is going to be working in big coastal cities. You know, cities are where people get out of poverty because cities produce scale and productivity. Every time you double the size of settlement, the productivity of the people working in it goes up by on average around 5%, something like that. So, you know, if you move people from small villages into big cities, you've doubled many times over. So you've got a big potential for productivity growth. But that's taking a pretty far-sighted view, and the here and now reality is of poverty in rural communities. And so, you know, this is a cop-out, but you're going to have to try and do both. And you're going to have to balance politically between the urgent needs of the here and now and the distant potential of a future prosperous Mozambique. And that's a political balancing act, right? I'm not suggesting that all the revenues should be devoted to building a distant future, but it is important that a significant part of the revenues are devoted to building a distant future. You know? Leave the resources in the ground in some situations. I mean, the obvious situation that springs to mind is Somalia. And back in September, we had the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Natural Resources from Somalia here for a week. They're facing a very difficult situation because they don't fully control the territory of federal Somalia at the moment. And so resource extraction companies are going in and saying, okay, federal government, you give me rights, here's the terms I want, but if you don't give them, I'll just bypass you. I'll go to Puntland or this land or that land, and you know, the pirates who run them will get the rights off that. So there's a real danger here. Now, the great philosopher John Rawls had a theory of justice in which the big idea was stand behind the veil of ignorance and decide what sort of society you want, what sort of rules you want. And geological ignorance is just that. It's until you've got the geology, you've got a natural veil of ignorance. You don't know where the natural resources will be in a society. And so Somalia at the moment is in this situation where there's a natural veil of ignorance. People haven't discovered stuff. So that's a great moment to build agreement. One of the things that Sir Khama did in Botswana was to go around the clans before they discovered diamonds and say, we've got nothing. Let's agree that anything we do find belongs to all of us. Now is the time to do that in Somalia. And the danger is that premature resource discoveries by companies just flying in and digging a few holes will rip away that veil of ignorance before the political consensus has been put in place that says Somali's resources belong to all Somalis. Once you've discovered they're here and not here, you know, Sheila's going to say, oh, they're mine, Paul. I'm sorry, they're mine, they're not yours. Why should I share them with you? And that's going to produce secession. You know, this is the road, basically the road to conflict, where you started us off. Thanks.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes. He's reminding me, you know, waving his flag there. Look, so to summarize maybe a few points. One is use the period of ignorance effectively by agreeing that if you find anything, it will be shared fairly, it will be shared equally. Whatever the rules of engagement, follow Cesar Khama's example. That's the first thing with natural resources. Then when you do discover them, eventually, make sure that the contracts are negotiated fairly with the best capacity available, adhere to EITI, Natural Resource Charter, African Mining Vision. All those will help the country see a clearer path through the exploitation of natural resources. But also, as you exploit natural resources, don't forget the communities, the local people, build cluster industries. I think one country which has built a huge cluster industry around mining is South Africa, and it's never spoken about. It's huge, from shipping to insurance to banking, everything, a huge cluster industry. And I think I was listening to Minister Konteh carefully. They're trying to articulate that. Now, I used to be in mining once. I sold the mine because I discovered that I would make more money selling overalls, paraphernalia, gloves, very high wear and tear. That was the best way to make money. So I sold the mine, and half the time, the gold mines, they're always flooded. They spend a lot of time trying to invest in generators to pump out the water 2 kilometers down underground. Imagine that. Not easy. So it's a tough business. Maybe we should leave these things underground. But
can I say something
yeah,
about that, please?
I thought I was summarizing. She wants to summarize, so you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, no, I think the lady really did ask an important question about, is there a time when either morally or other reasons you should leave them? Actually, there is, because you mine because you presume that the aggregated value of economic, social, and environment is sound. And so when one of those elements of the tripartite is not met, in my view, you shouldn't mine. But it also raises another very important question, which is to say, is there a danger that as we don't exploit resources responsibly, that we are opening the door to synthetic alternatives? And therefore, what will that do to countries that are resource endowed? This is my worst nightmare.
Okay. Well said. Two more things. So let's press on. So basically, it's important to manage the revenues efficiently by investing in infrastructure, in cities that work, in human capital development, health services, education, as Botswana does. We have to invest these resources efficiently in the betterment of mankind. I mean, there's a huge expectation on these natural resources. You're better at me in moving this than I am. And we need to manage expectation. I listened carefully to his question about managing expectations now, promising people roads in the future because you need to, invest in the future. How do you manage those expectations in Mozambique? People are taking arms. They're saying we want to benefit now. You are enjoying yourselves in Maputo. We in the Tete province have nothing. Those are the real issues. Central African Republic, of course, and then you mix that with religious differences, it's just an explosive situation. Mali is not dissimilar. We know that natural resources are also at the core of the whole of these issues with Tuaregs and so forth. And the list is long. So thank you for listening. Please, a round of applause to our panelists, Minister Konteh, Dr. Thompson, Sheila, Khama, and last but not least, Paul Collier.